In 476 AD, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus sat on the throne of an empire that had ruled for over 1,000 years. He was the last Western Roman emperor. No war ended it, no dramatic final battle. A Germanic general simply told him to step down, and he did. But what if he hadn't? What if Rome had survived? To understand what could have happened, we first need to understand what actually did. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was buckling under pressure from every direction. Its economy was in decline, heavy taxation, a shrinking middle class, and a currency that had been debased for generations. Its military, once the most feared fighting force in the world, now relied heavily on foreign mercenaries, many of whom had little loyalty to Rome itself. Politically, the empire was fractured. Emperors were assassinated, replaced, and ignored by regional generals who held the real power. And in 285 AD, the empire had split in two, an eastern half centered in Constantinople and a western half centered in Rome. The eastern half was wealthier, more stable, and better defended. The western half was not so lucky. Wave after wave of migrating and invading peoples, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Huns, pushed into Roman territory. In 410 AD, Rome itself was sacked for the first time in 800 years. By 476, there wasn't much empire left to save, so the fall wasn't really one event. It was decades of erosion, which means, if we want to ask, what if, we need to find the moment where a different decision could have stopped the bleeding. Let's rewind to the 450s. This is the decade where our alternate timeline splits from reality. In our timeline, a series of weak, short-lived emperors failed to unify Rome's remaining resources. But imagine instead, a capable, ruthless reformer takes the throne, someone like Majorian, a real emperor from this period, who historians consider one of the most talented rulers Rome had left. In our timeline, Majorian ruled for 4 years before being betrayed and executed by his own general. What if he hadn't been? In this alternate history, Majorian survives, consolidates power, and does what Rome desperately needed. He reforms the tax system to actually fund the military, negotiates lasting treaties with Germanic tribes instead of fighting endless wars against them, and rebuilds a professional Roman army loyal to the throne rather than to individual generals. This isn't pure fantasy. We have a real-world proof of concept. While the West was collapsing, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, did exactly this. Through strong central leadership, a defensible capital, and smarter diplomacy, the East survived for another 1,000 years, falling only in 1453. So the question isn't, could Rome have survived? It's why didn't the West do what the East did? And in our alternate timeline, it does. If the Western Empire stabilizes in the late 5th century, the effects ripple outward for centuries. First, there's no power vacuum in Western Europe. In our real history, Rome's collapse created the conditions historians once called the Dark Ages. Fragmented kingdoms, collapsed trade networks, and centuries of instability before Europe recovered. If Rome holds, that vacuum never opens. Roads, aqueducts, and trade routes keep functioning instead of falling into disrepair. Second, the map of Europe looks completely different. Nations like France, Germany, and Spain emerged from the tribal kingdoms that filled the void Rome left behind. If Rome never leaves that space, those nations, as we know them, likely never form. Instead, we might see a Europe organized more like the Byzantine East, as provinces of a continuing empire, or eventually breaking away as Roman-influenced states, rather than entirely new cultures. Third, technology and science. This one's genuinely debated among historians. Some argue a stable, unified Rome would have kept accumulating and spreading knowledge instead of losing it, potentially accelerating innovation by centuries. Others argue the opposite, that Rome's rigid bureaucracy and reliance on slave labor actually discouraged the kind of labor-saving inventions that later drove Europe's growth. It's possible a surviving Rome could have stagnated exactly where it was, while a fragmented Europe was forced to innovate its way out of collapse. And fourth, religion. The Catholic Church filled much of the power vacuum left by Rome's collapse, becoming the dominant unifying institution in medieval Europe. If the empire never falls, the Church's rise to political power may never happen the same way, reshaping the entire religious and political landscape of the next 1,000 years. So, would Rome surviving have been a good thing? Maybe, maybe not. That's what makes this question so interesting. A surviving Rome might have prevented centuries of instability and preserved knowledge that was otherwise lost, or it might have simply delayed the same collapse by a few generations, while also preventing the very fragmentation that forced medieval Europe to eventually innovate its way into the Renaissance. What this thought experiment really reveals is this: Rome's fall wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific human decisions. Bad tax policy, disloyal generals, short-sighted treaties, made over and over again for decades. Change enough of those decisions, and history bends somewhere else entirely. So here's a question worth sitting with. Do you think large empires are always destined to collapse eventually? Or was Rome's fall something that could have genuinely been avoided? If you enjoyed exploring this alternate timeline, subscribe, because next we're asking an even bigger question. What if the Library of Alexandria had never burned and humanity never lost centuries of ancient knowledge? Let me know in the comments which what if you want explored next.